really analyze ideology, you realize that at the end of the day, there's a force behind it, which is the force of human will, of what the ancients called the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate. Especially St. Augustine is very clear on this. And that they're simply using ideas as a tool for power. And this is what the core difference between ideology and ideas.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka. Today on the podcast, we are joined by my friend Enrique Pallares. Enrique holds an MA and PhD in political theory from the Catholic University of America. His research interests include the history of philosophy, continental philosophy, history of liberalism, ideology and totalitarianism, personalism, and philosophy and literature. He's been a fellow at the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at Washington College and a teaching fellow at the Catholic University of America. He was an ISI Weaver Fellow and is a regular contributor to the yearly Eric Voegelin Society meeting at APSA. Enrique lives with his family at Casa Carmen, a farm and winery in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Great to have you with us, Enrique.
Thank you, Johnny. It's great to be here. It's a pleasure.
Before we begin with our interview, we'd like to thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in fulfilling that mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcast to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Well, it's wonderful to have you on the show, Enrique, and congrats again on a successful defense of your dissertation last month. Before we get to the dissertation, which I do want to talk about, I want to begin a little more generally talking about American and European liberalism and conservatism. And I'd like to start with Russell Kirk. At ISI, we love Kirk. We have our students in the honors program read The Roots of American Order, which maps out, Kirk's case that 5 cities, Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, and Philadelphia, were the principal cities and their ideas that shaped the institutions we live in today in America and the West. And, one tradition that is left off of that list is the Spanish tradition. You don't see Barcelona or Madrid on that list. And in light of the contributions that the Spanish have made both to Catholic and Western civilization, I'm wondering if you might be able to make the case for why the Spanish tradition might be included and to introduce our listeners to some of the key ideas. Let's start with Spanish conservatism, and then we can talk about Spanish liberalism and how that might be different than what we conventionally think of when we think of liberalism today.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. And I think I myself have been I'm familiar with the work of Russell Kirk in great part thanks to ISI and to having been a fellow and having participated in the wonderful programs that it offers. So it's been very edifying for my personal education. It's funny because when we talk about the 5 cities, I wouldn't add Madrid or Barcelona, but I would add Cadiz. Which Cadiz is a fascinating city in southwestern Spain that sort of faces the Atlantic and where they have the famous Cadiz Constitution of 1812 was written. The reason that this is important is because, the Spain very broadly, I think, has been and the Iberian Peninsula, including I think Portugal and even when you consider Hispanic America as well, has been sort of left out of the Western canon. I think because there's this sort of conception that it is sort of mysterious and difficult to understand and passionate and but not really relevant to the serious thinking of the West, But there's a wonderful philosopher whose name was Julian Marias, who wrote a book called Intelligible Spain. And he argues actually the opposite, that Spain is a very and was always a very coherent and intelligible project. That from even the early days when the Romans called the Iberian Peninsula the province of Hispania, that there was a very coherent notion of what Spain was and was supposed to be So he sort of tries to get away from this notion of mystery and incomprehensibility. And very particularly relevant to our discussion is this notion of the Cadiz Constitution, because that's, I think, the peak of the intelligibility of Spain. First, it is the place and the time where liberalism becomes a coin for the first time in a political sense. So we can only be really liberal if we're going to be coherent with history and with concepts. We truly can only speak of liberalism insofar as liberalism aligns with the liberalism of Cadiz of 1812, when a group of people called Los Liberales gathered together in Cadiz, and these included people from Spain and from what was called at the time the Spains, which was also the American continent, to create a constitution that was a very interesting and particular one, because it was based the way that they saw it. And this is what we have to do. We have to understand how they saw themselves. And they saw themselves as liberals. They called themselves Los Liberales, but they were pro-monarchy, pro-tradition, and their whole way of viewing liberalism was based on the Spanish local medieval charters. These were legal documents that basically argued for localism. And so liberalism in the Spanish context is not at all anti-tradition, and does not really emerge out of this Enlightenment need to create a new political form. But in the Spanish context, it's just a continuation of its medieval practices. So I think to the broader conversation of what liberalism is and is not, the Spanish tradition is particularly relevant, because it's very different than the French and the British articulations, and also because they're the ones that invented the word. So I think it should be taken into account. And in the Spanish context as a whole, that sort of this tradition that Julian Marias, which I mentioned, was talking about, that was very clear. Spain is this sort of is this sort of traditionalist Spain that respects the dignity and freedom of human persons.
So you would locate the emergence of constitutionalism, particularly the Constitution of 1812, in the medieval. Can you maybe expand on the medieval contracts that that existed that would have informed Spanish constitutionalism?
Yeah, totally. These were called the fueros, and they were local charters that outlined the sort of rights that local communities had in relation to the crown. And these even included, in some cases, the ability to elect local leaders. And it was and to make decisions aside from the crown, or insofar as they weren't, of course, they had to be sort of aligned with this greater vision of what Spain was. But it is very interesting when you start thinking, well, perhaps liberalism is not this sort of Enlightenment modern project, but it is actually a medieval project, and a project that is not that is sort of continues from the original realization that human beings are free persons full of dignity. The realization that really comes with to its fullness with Christianity, and that sort of slowly develops over time, and in the medieval period starts kind of gaining traction, and you see it being explicitly articulated in the Cadiz Constitution of 1812.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that the genesis of Western liberalism is the High Middle Ages, and it's not purely just something that came after the Reformation and Renaissance and Enlightenment, even if those things may have helped to create the political circumstances that kind of crystallized various liberal movements. I'm curious that in that Constitution of 1812, who opposed, if anyone, opposed the Constitution of 1812 in Spain?
Yeah, the funny thing about it is that the Constitution of 1812 was widely successful. In fact, the problems with Spain that sort of reach a boiling point in 1936 with the Spanish Civil War actually start right around the time of the Constitution, but not because of the Constitution, but really because of the Napoleonic invasion. So in 1808, Napoleon first invades Spain. During that time, there's already all these liberals are already working on the Constitution, which finally comes to its form in 1812. It's widely accepted and supported, but the problem is that when Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, is put in Spain as Spain's new king, um, there's a very new and but very strong anti-monarchic sense that starts developing in Spain. But this, if you look at it closely, is not really an anti-monarchic sentiment as much as it is an anti-invasive monarchic sentiment.
Yeah. They want independence and self-rule. Yeah.
That's right, and by this point, you gotta remember what had just happened just a couple of decades before in France. So the sort of radicalism that arrives in Spain at this point is very, very different than the kind of liberalism that the liberals of 1812 were about. So Spain actually does become very radicalized, but that happens only as a result of the French invasion. So
Interesting.
it's a sort of crazy kind of historical accident that buries these sort of more sober, conservative, liberal tradition of Spain in the French invasion, and that sort of it just never really becomes well known in the wider culture and in other countries throughout Europe and the U.S.
Interesting. Yeah. So in that sense, Spanish liberalism, it seems to be much more organic, certainly than French liberalism. I'm wondering if you could maybe compare. I think the way that most conservatives are taught about liberalisms is that the French liberalism is bad. You read Burke's writings on the revolution. English liberalism is good, kind of begins with Magna Carta and Glorious Revolution. And that is the liberalism that very much inspired, the American founding. Of course, certain founders like Jefferson were perhaps more enamored with French liberalism. And so we make that distinction between the American Revolution was kind of recovering these ancient English liberties, and the French Revolution was much more ideological and radical. How does just in broad strokes, what would the difference be? I mean, it sounds like Spanish liberalism might have more in common with English liberalism than French liberalism. What might the differences be between English and Spanish liberalism?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's really the heart of the matter. Because I think in terms of revolutionary excesses, we can almost dismiss the French version and just say, listen, like this is, it very clearly resulted in terrible things. With the British one, it's a bit more of a question, though. I think there's good people arguing out there, of course, that itself is deeply problematic as well. But the similarities, I would say, are that they're definitely both more conservative and more organic. However, there's an interesting letter from the late 1700s that a Spanish statesman and thinker called Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos wrote to a British consul, in which he says, you criticize our methods, and because you call them too slow, but I am not willing to sacrifice the present generation for any future ones. Rather, all real progress is very slow, and I do not believe in revolutions, because that is really not real politics. So the interesting thing about this letter, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, but the interesting about this letter is that it provides a sort of window into just how deeply rooted and conservative the Spanish liberal tradition was. That even in the case of the British one, it was seen as being even more conservative than that. Now, the interesting thing is that Spanish liberalism actually becomes quite radical after the French invasion, and does not remain that sort of liberalism. But that's, I think, a good comparison.
Today, as you're looking at the state of things in America, there's a group of people, some of them, friends of mine or friends of ISI, who are, I think you might say that they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but they're really kind of focusing on the fact that America was a liberal project in a bad sense. That's essentially the argument that they would make, and that the situation we find ourselves in today, where you have, the most radical cultural, political, and economic sort of an assault on everything we hold dear coming from the left, that's now infected everything from academia to business to politics. You can't, look at your phone without getting a new news update or tweet about something crazy. That this really is just the logical outworking of sort of the Anglo-American liberalism. And I'm wondering what you I'm wondering what you make of that critique, but maybe what you make of that critique generally. But then I think another layer to kind of probe is it seems to me, I am not Catholic, but it seems to me that liberalism, to some extent, to a large extent, is actually an outgrowth of Western Catholic political thinking from the High Middle Ages to the 20th century. And so I'm wondering, how do you read some of the sort of the integralists? I think maybe there's two levels to this. One is, what do you make of their critique of where we're at today? The second is, what do you make of their philosophy vis-a-vis the sort of organic development of Catholic political thought over the ages? Are they just kind of lasering in on maybe something like Unam Sanctam, right, where it's talking about the subjection of the political order to the papacy, and are they just living in one particular historic, like, did they just go back in time to a particular slice of Catholicism and they want to make that the norm? Are they missing the broader kind of story as it's developed? So two levels. What do you make of their current critique, and what do you make of their position vis-a-vis Catholic political thought and development?
Yeah. I think in the regards to the first one, I think there's a terminological difficulty, and I know the names of who you're speaking about, and maybe we should all have a conversation sometime. But because I think there are very legitimate critiques and very good points to say that sort of the Anglo-American tradition of liberalism contained the seed of its own destruction and all of this. I understand those points and think they have quite a bit of validity. Now, I think that making liberalism the boogeyman is a sort of conceptual problem, because especially when we consider this tradition that I'm speaking about, and the sort of the fact that it was even in this Spanish context that the word itself was coined, I think we need to give a little bit more credence to what those liberals that coined the word meant by liberalism. And we have a sort of, as philosophers, we have sort of like this duty to look at all the evidence throughout history, and to say and to kind of like incorporate this sort of information. So the narrative that kind of that liberalism is an invention to sort of accommodate multiculturalism, and therefore the state kind of becomes the ultimate legislator above all other things, because it's the only objective truth, and therefore all of our beliefs become subjective, and all these. I think is definitely a problem, and it's the problem of the secular state. But it is not necessarily a problem of liberalism, I would argue. I think that liberalism, in fact, has some great advantages in its very malleability as a concept, but it does have to be, I think, ultimately tied to its historical emergence. And it was, to tie to the second part of your question, very much an emergence not within Enlightenment multiculturalism, but within Middle-aged Catholicism. And here is where perhaps it's most useful to connect it to the notion of time and eternity and progress and tradition, and perhaps where we also connect it to the work of Unamuno, which is where my work centers around. Because what Catholicism, I think, brings to the table is this sort of connection between an acceptance of the tradition, but also a knowing that the tradition is always a living tradition that never becomes sort of ossified in the past. That is not just a matter of following the old roads because they are the right roads, but it's a way of interpreting the old roads in light of the current reality and the current context and the continual disclosure of truth. And so you see these, of course. Christ is a perfect example of this, and you know, the kind of the fight between Christ and the Pharisees is a great example of the opposition between a kind of old law and the new truth. And then, but then you see, you know, there's when you think about something like the Second Vatican Council or Pope John Paul II as a thinker in general, I think is also a good example of this in terms of thinking, well, there is this great tradition that we cannot sacrifice any of its essence, yet we have to meet the modern world is in its own terms, because there are some although the human nature doesn't change, there are some very new real demands that do change. And Catholicism is very much open to that. So in regards to the Unamuno himself, you know, Unamuno kind of writes a book called In Torno al Casticismo, which means Casticismo is kind of like the Spanish culture. And so this is about Spanish culture, and he writes this book right around the time of what was called El Gran Desastre, the Great Disaster, which was the loss of the Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War of 1898. So you know, Spain had been a giant empire, had started losing that empire over a number of years, and in 1898 it finally loses, you know, the Philippines and Cuba, and it sort of becomes just a nation. Is no longer an empire, and sort of this sort of flings Spain into a question of identity and self-doubt, and creates an entire generation of artists and thinkers called the generation of 98, because it becomes such a poignant and prominent time. But in this book, Unamuno basically talks about how those that only look to the past are inevitably obsessed with their shadows, and those who only look to the future are blinded by the sun, and how there is a need to live what he calls intrahistorically.
Okay.
And intrahistory is this notion where you say, well, history has its roots in eternity, but it manifests itself in time.
Okay.
And when we live intrahistorically, we understand that we and our people sort of are deeply grounded in our history, but that there is also a radical openness required to confront the world in its modern forms. So yeah,
what did that mean for Unamuno?
What's that?
What did that look like for Unamuno?
So Unamuno himself considered himself very explicitly a liberal of the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. So that what that meant is that, and this is why I think it's so fascinating, because we have an example of somebody that lived in deeply ideological times, and this is what it meant for him. You got to think that. You got to realize, so he was born in, you know, the Bilbao, in the Basque country of what was called La Tacita de Plata, the little silver cup Bilbao, which was a 5,000 person pre-industrialized city in northern Spain.
In what year was this that he was born?
And in 1864.
Okay.
So he lives through the industrialization of Bilbao, and with all the problems that brings. It grows in population by 5 times in the next 20 years. And with all the problems that brings, he lives through the first, through the last Carlist War, which was a sort of premonition of the Civil War, and through the rise of all the totalitarian movements of the 20th century. And the rise of communism, which in the case of Spain was that were called the Republicans, which can be sometimes a little bit confusing for American interpreters, but the Republicans, who were these kind of like revolutionaries, and he lives these very, very ideological times. And what this does to him, with his conception of intrahistory, which I ultimately argue that is a notion of the human person, what that does to him is that it allows him to always act non-ideologically. So that obviously meant that he got into a lot of fights with a lot of people, because he was basically forced to choose sides, and he refused to do so. He opposed truth where he opposed a falsity with by putting truth forward wherever falsity emerged. And if falsity emerged in the form of the difference between a kind of a totalitarian military regime of Franco versus the communist revolutionaries of the Republican Army, he opposed both of them. And supported them at times too, when he thought that they had the possibility of doing something great, and then turned on them when they didn't. So while you had in Germany at the same time a deep philosopher like Martin Heidegger, for instance, falling for National Socialism and kind of making these terrible political mistakes. In the case of Unamuno, is interesting because it is his philosophy that sort of allows him to be this kind of a non-ideological actor and thinker, and I argue that is the sort of 1812 Cadiz form of liberalism.
Could you talk a little bit more about his critiques of ideology, and specifically the idea of ideocracy, and what he has in mind with that term, and what's the proper relationship between the human being and ideas?
That's kind of the heart of the matter in many ways, because we live in such ideological times where in fact, when we if you go to any university and talk to people in their late teens and early 20s, they'll probably just they just talk about which ideology do you have and which one do you do. It's just synonym nowadays to what you believe in. And in fact, probably they would call Christianity an ideology, and all these different forms of thinking. But of course, ideology is itself a very problematic mode of understanding what ideas really are. First, because it emerges within the communist context. The notion of ideology as such, and there's some great work, and there's actually a recent essay called "What is Ideology" by Mark Shiffman that I recommend looking into. A very nice kind of history and overview of the word. But basically, ideology is a closed system of that has a very particular plan and a very particular objective. And that basically forces the person to close themselves to reality and to their experience of all phenomena, and interpret everything that happens to them in light of these ideology that has been given, of this system. So, for example, in the case of Marxism, you got to interpret everything in terms of the struggle of the classes, and ultimately the goal is the revolution. And everything that happens has to be interpreted in that way. And you can transfer this to identity politics and to anything that you want, this sort of structure of thinking. And Unamuno is what he tries to do for much of his time is to sort of tear down the veils of ideology. So, and this is why he's obsessed with death. Very, very interestingly, because people can carry around ideologies until they really realize their own mortality. The moment that you really realize that you want to exist forever because you would love to be immortal, because you cannot believe the unbearable lightness of your own being, but that you also have the certainty of your death. Unamuno argues that is the point at which people sort of break, and stop resorting to ideological solutions, but instead say, well, no, really, what do I really believe in when I have my death right in front of me, and what is really the right thing to do in every situation. This is also, by the way, not so different from what Socrates did. I mean, when Socrates is surrounded by hostile listeners in the Gorgias, he does the same thing. He points to personal mortality and say, like, well, listen, you're gonna die, so how about we get real when we speak, and for Unamuno particularly, the worst ideology is he blames scientism for being really this kind of completely destructive force in his time, which I think to this day we could probably agree. But what it's doing, when you really analyze ideology, you realize that at the end of the day, there's a force behind it, which is the force of human will, of what the ancients called the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate. Especially St. Augustine is very clear on this, and that they're simply using ideas as a tool for power. And this is what the core difference between ideology and ideas. Ideas require a fundamental openness to truth, that you look at an idea and you think about it and you talk about it and you realize whether or not it is true. It is held by the highest standard. Ideology, on the other hand, is given already chewed up and as a sort of closed system, and you are supposed to abide to its orthodoxy, rather than interpret reality. So
yeah, you read all of your experiences in light of your closed ideological system instead of letting the experiences inform your understanding of reality. So maybe transitioning, we have a few more minutes left. A couple of questions on today. I think it's fair to say that our times are highly ideologically charged, certainly more so than they were when we were both growing up, in high school or college. And the stakes seem so high in terms of what our civilization is facing. What advice would Unamuno have, or what is his philosophy? What would it offer us now, in terms of, to what extent can we afford to sit in the sidelines or to strategically retreat, versus at what point do you have to say, no, we have to, fight more directly for our civilization and for our liberties?
Yeah. My whole work in Unamuno is framed around the question that Christ gives his disciples as an answer to their question, where he turns and he says, "But you, who do you say that I am?" I think that we all have to recognize the fact that we are persons, and that means that we are free, and that we have dignity, and that we are infinite sources of value and worlds unto ourselves, and in relation to a whole world of persons. But what that means is that the great burden of freedom, Johnny, and this is if anybody thinks that freedom is easy to deal with, they should go back to the Grand Inquisitor, to Dostoevsky's One Inquisitor, and remember what is the real difficulty of freedom, But it is the realization that life begins with responsibility, that existence is responsibility, literally, our ability to respond to the existing demands of reality. Those demands are placed upon us before we begin thinking or acting. We don't choose whether or not a demand is placed upon us. We just choose how we respond to it.
Sure.
Not responding is a form of response. So I think this is where Unamuno would simply say to each person, answer that question of, who do you say that I am, for yourself, and follow through with the consequences. And for some people, For some people, these might mean running to the trenches right away, and for some people, it might mean something different. It has to do with the personal mission of everybody in this world. But avoiding responsibility is not an option, because your soul is at stake.
Couldn't have put that better myself. In closing, shifting in a little bit of a different direction, I'm curious in terms of your thoughts on the Hispanic community in the United States. I know, especially in the state of Florida, where you have lived, spent a period of your upbringing. There's an increasing sense that the Hispanic community, especially the Cuban community, is becoming, they always were very conservative culturally, but politically they're becoming more conservative. And I think you saw that in the last governor's election, where DeSantis's victory and flipping some of these counties in Florida that had really never been flipped before, largely because of support from Latinos. So I'm curious, your just general thoughts on the role that Hispanics might play in shaping the future of conservatism in this country.
Yeah, the Romans used to say that those from the province of Hispania mispronounced the word vivire, and they pronounced it vivre, which means drinking. So they said that to be a Hispanian is to live as drinking, and I own a winery, so this is my political task in many ways, because I think that the most powerful thing that I think some of these that I think the Hispanic culture brings to the table is a culture of family and hospitality and enjoyment, and we forget how profoundly the political this stance is, because it is the realization that your greatest political task is what you owe to your community, to your family, to those around you. It is the love of your neighbor, quite literally, and the treating well of one another in the most intimate reality. Think about the difference between the modern self-serving philanthropist that goes to try to help in Africa with people with ways that Africans don't need or want. In fact, we've had this issue a lot, where people say, "Well, no, this is not what we want. We want something else." But there's this sort of like, arrogance to this stance. It's like, well, I'll help humanity, but as Dostoevsky's humanitarian doctor says in The Brothers Karamazov, he could help humanity, but he could not sleep with another man in the same room, because humans are so disgusting. And what Christianity teaches us is exactly the opposite. And this is what I think Hispanic culture really brings to the table. This sort of a very intimate, familial and neighborly attitude. This deep sense of hospitality, which is inherently traditional in this sense. And I think what maybe some of these communities are seeing is that with the excessive politicization of reality, what has happened is that it seems like everything is political nowadays, and people and because it's so ideological, and people just wanna sometimes just love one another and have room to do exactly that. And in order to do that, the state really needs to take a step back. There needs to be room for human relationships to flourish and unfold without the imposition of a political ideological plan that is completely extrinsic to the reality of human relations. So I think really that's the heart of it. It's a kind of cultural revolution that seeks to return to more primordial forms of relating to one another and more traditional forms of relating to one another.
Great. Well, I think that's the perfect note to end our conversation. Thanks so much for joining us, Enrique. If people are interested in following you or reading more of your work, where should they look?
I don't know for now. I'm working on turning this whole thing into a book. I think for now they can probably just drink my wine.
There we go. And what's the website for your winery?
Casa Carmen, CASA, and Carmen, CARMEN, wines.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining and tuning in to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.